I overheard them at the funeral planning everything. But what happened next? At 47, I thought I understood the depths of human betrayal. My father had just lost his battle with pancreatic cancer after 11 grueling months, and I was emotionally eviscerated, hollowed out from watching the strongest man I knew fade into nothing. But what I discovered at his funeral about my own family would shatter everything I believed about loyalty, blood, and justice. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that their betrayal didn't just hurt you, it fundamentally changed who you are? Because what happened next taught me that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones sharpening the knife for your back. The funeral was held at Riverside Memorial Chapel, one of those places that tries too hard to feel comforting with its burgundy carpets and soft lighting that makes everyone look like they're underwater. Dad was 66 when he passed, still too young, but cancer doesn't negotiate with your retirement dreams. We'd had this complicated relationship, my father and I. He wasn't the type to say he loved you outright, more the figure it out yourself, life's tough, deal with it kind of parent. But beneath all that gruff exterior was this unshakable respect between us. He pushed me because he believed I could handle whatever life threw at me. At least that's what I choose to believe now that he's gone forever. There were maybe 50 people there that day. Dad wasn't exactly the life of the party, but he had his circle of loyal friends and business associates. After the main service, I needed a moment to collect myself. 11 months of watching someone you love deteriorate is like emotional sandpaper, wearing you down until there's nothing left but raw nerve endings. I wandered into this small side room off the main hall, one of those quiet alcoves funeral homes provide for people who need to fall apart privately. I sank into this overstuffed leather armchair in the corner, closed my eyes, and just tried to breathe without feeling like my chest was going to cave in. That's when I heard them. The connecting door to the viewing room was slightly ajar, and my uncles Marcus and Vincent came in, their voices floating through that crack like poison gas. Before I could even process who was speaking, Uncle Marcus was mid-sentence, his voice dripping with this casual cruelty that made my skin crawl. The way he looked at me during the service, like I'm supposed to feel guilty or something. He's always been weak, just like his mother. Uncle Vincent's reply hit me like a physical blow. Christopher takes after her side, not ours. Thank God for that. I froze in that chair like a deer caught in headlights. They were talking about me. I should have announced my presence immediately, but something in their tone, this venomous satisfaction, kept me paralyzed. What came next would haunt me for the rest of my life. The fool has absolutely no idea we changed Dad's will just 5 weeks ago, Marcus said, and I could practically hear the malicious grin in his voice. Everything goes to us now instead of that disappointment. They were literally standing 3 feet from my father's casket, laughing while my dad's body lay there cold and still. The sound of their amusement felt like glass shards in my ears. He thinks he's inheriting the house, the business, everything, Vincent added, his voice thick with cruel satisfaction. Wait until Tuesday when Reynolds reads the will. The look on his face will be absolutely priceless. Best decision we ever made, catching Dad when he was all doped up on those morphine drips. He would have signed his own death warrant by that point. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to ice in my veins. The room started spinning as the full horror of what they were saying hit me like a freight train. They had manipulated my dying father when he was barely conscious from pain medication. I gripped the armrest of that chair so hard my knuckles went white and my fingertips went numb. Betrayal was so complete, so soul-crushing, that for a moment I couldn't even process it as reality. Christopher couldn't run a corner coffee shop, let alone Dad's company, Vincent continued, his voice getting more animated with each cruel word. The business would be bankrupt within 18 months with him in charge. We're saving the family legacy from complete destruction. Marcus laughed again, this sound that will echo in my nightmares forever. Well, it's not his problem anymore. I already told Sarah we won't be needing her services after next week. No point keeping Dad's charity cases on the payroll when we take over. Sarah, Dad's housekeeper and caregiver for the past 18 years. The woman who had basically moved into our house during his chemotherapy, who held his hand during the worst nights, who treated him with more dignity and compassion than his own brothers. They were planning to fire her like she was nothing more than an outdated appliance. I sat there literally trembling with a rage so pure and intense it scared me. I'm not being dramatic when I say my hands were shaking like I was having some kind of seizure, but I didn't say a word. Didn't burst through that door and confront them. Didn't scream at them for desecrating my father's memory. I just listened as they continued to plot and scheme and congratulate themselves on their successful manipulation of a dying man. Eventually, someone called for them from the main hall, and they left, still chuckling about their brilliant deception. I remained in that chair for maybe another 25 minutes, trying to process what I just heard. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that part of me wondered if I was having some kind of grief-induced hallucination. But the crystal clear memory of their voices, the specific details they'd shared, the casual cruelty in their laughter, it was all too real to be anything but the devastating truth. I'm not going to lie to you. In that moment, I wanted to follow them out to the parking lot and beat them both into unconsciousness with my bare hands. The image of my uncles laughing next to my father's casket while plotting to steal everything he'd worked for, it burned itself into my brain like a brand. But my dad had always taught me one fundamental rule about conflict. Never start a fight until you know exactly how you're going to win it. And right then, sitting in that funeral home chair with my world crumbling around me, I had no idea what my next move should be. So I somehow made it through the rest of the funeral. I accepted condolences from family friends, nodded appropriately at all the "he was such a good man" comments, thanked everyone for coming, all while my uncles watched me with these smug little smiles. They probably thought they were so clever, having pulled off the perfect crime right under everyone's noses. If they only knew what was coming. After everyone left, I drove to Dad's house, our house technically, though it felt strange calling it mine now. I'd grown up in that two-story colonial with its creaky hardwood floors and windows that never quite closed properly. Every corner held some memory, good and bad. The dining room where Dad would quiz me on algebra until I wanted to scream. The backyard where he taught me to throw a football, badly, since neither of us had any athletic ability whatsoever. The garage where we spent 3 summers restoring that old Mustang when I was 17, working side by side in comfortable silence broken only by his occasional "hand me that wrench" or my frustrated sighs when something wouldn't cooperate. When I walked through the front door, I found Sarah in the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked startled to see me, like she hadn't expected anyone to stop by. "Oh, Christopher," she said, quickly wiping at her face with a dish towel. "I was just tidying up a bit. Are you holding up okay?" "Are you?" I asked, even though her devastated expression made the answer obvious. She hesitated for a moment, then just shook her head like the weight of everything was too much to carry. "Your uncle stopped by this morning before the service," she said quietly. "They informed me I should start looking for another position. Said once the will is read on Tuesday, they'll be taking over all household management and won't require my services anymore." That familiar rage started building in my chest again, but this time it felt different. More focused, more dangerous. "They have absolutely no right to make those decisions," I told her. "It's okay," she interrupted, trying to force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your father prepared me for this possibility. He told me those vultures would try to swoop in the moment he was gone. He just said to trust that he'd taken care of everything." We talked for another hour, and Sarah filled in more pieces of the puzzle that had been forming in my mind. According to her, Dad had been increasingly worried about his brothers during his final months. They'd started visiting more frequently once his condition deteriorated, but always when I wasn't around, always bringing legal documents, always insisting on complete privacy. Sarah also mentioned something that made my pulse quicken. Dad had been very specific about a safety deposit box at Central Trust Bank downtown, insisting that some important papers needed to stay away from the house where prying eyes might find them. I ended up staying at Dad's place that night. I couldn't face the thought of returning to my empty apartment, couldn't handle being alone with my thoughts in a space that didn't hold any memories of him. I fell asleep on the living room couch around 4 in the morning after spending hours looking through old photo albums, trying to reconcile the loving father in those pictures with the man my uncles claimed had rejected me in his final days. I woke up Tuesday morning to discover my phone had exploded overnight. 31 missed calls. 31. From Uncle Marcus, Uncle Vincent, their wives, even my cousins who I hadn't spoken to in years. Plus about 55 text messages demanding to know where I was and insisting I call back immediately. The desperation in their messages was almost palpable, and for the first time since I'd overheard them laughing at the funeral, I felt something other than devastation. I felt hope. Whatever had happened, whatever they discovered, had them absolutely panicking. And you know what? For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Because something told me that my father, even in death, was about to get the last laugh on his scheming brothers. I didn't return any of their calls. Not yet. Instead, I texted my longtime friend Marcus. Yes, confusing, I know. But my Marcus has been my closest confidant since we were kids building tree forts and getting into trouble together. He knows more about legal procedures than most actual lawyers, thanks to his work in corporate compliance, and more importantly, he's the kind of person you want in your corner when the world is falling apart. While waiting for my friend to arrive, I started methodically searching through Dad's home office. I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking for, but I needed to be doing something productive instead of just sitting there consumed by rage and grief. The room still carried his scent, that distinctive combination of black coffee and the pine-scented hand sanitizer he'd become obsessed with during his illness. His reading glasses were still sitting on the desk next to a half-completed crossword puzzle, and seeing them there made my throat close up with emotion. That's when I remembered our last real conversation, maybe 4 weeks before he died, before the heavy pain medications turned him into a shadow of himself. I'd been sitting with him in his bedroom, trying to coax him into drinking one of those awful protein shakes that smelled like chalk and false promises. Out of nowhere, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength despite his deteriorated condition and told me he needed to make sure I understood something crucial. He said that Marcus and Vincent had been circling like hungry sharks lately, and that they'd always resented the fact that Grandpa had chosen him to run the family business instead of splitting control 3 ways. Dad told me he'd made special arrangements to protect what was rightfully mine, but he needed me to promise I'd fight if they tried to pull anything underhanded. At the time, I'd assumed he was just being paranoid from all the morphine coursing through his system. Now I realized he'd been having one of his last truly lucid moments, trying to prepare me for exactly what was happening. My friend Marcus arrived around noon, and I unloaded everything on him. What I'd overheard at the funeral, Sarah's situation, the 31 desperate phone calls, all of it. He didn't interrupt, just took detailed notes on his phone while I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed he was processing the legal implications of everything I was telling him. When I finished, the first thing he asked was whether Dad had had regular medical care at home during his final weeks. That's when I remembered Stephanie. Stephanie had been Dad's home health nurse for the final 3 months. A compassionate woman in her late 20s who always wore these cheerful floral scrubs and played soft jazz music while she worked. Dad had actually liked her, which was saying something since he generally had no patience for people who treated him like he was made of spun glass. I still had her contact information saved in my phone from all those late-night calls about medication schedules and emergency situations. I called her right there with my friend listening on speaker. She seemed surprised but happy to hear from me, and when I explained what I was trying to understand, she became incredibly helpful. Yes, she confirmed, my uncles had visited multiple times during Dad's final weeks, but always when I wasn't there. They'd always insisted on private time with Dad, even when she explained that he was heavily medicated and not really capable of meaningful conversation. The crucial detail that made my blood boil: the last time they'd visited, which must have been when they coerced him into signing their fraudulent will, Dad wasn't even fully conscious. Stephanie said she'd walked in once during their private meeting to check his vital signs and found Marcus literally holding Dad's hand with a pen, guiding it across some legal document, while Vincent and a man she didn't recognize watched intently. She'd thought it was strange, but figured it was just family business that wasn't her concern. When she'd mentioned the incident to Sarah later, Sarah had tried to call me immediately, but I'd been stuck in a client meeting and missed the call. By the time I checked my voicemail and called back, Dad had taken a turn for the worse, and the whole thing got lost in the chaos of managing his declining condition. My friend looked like he was about to say something when my phone started ringing again. Marcus and Vincent, calling from what appeared to be Marcus's house based on the caller ID. I almost ignored it automatically, but my friend suggested I answer and record the conversation. He reminded me that our state only requires one-party consent for call recording, so it would be completely legal evidence. I put the call on speaker and hit record. Marcus started talking immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. He said I needed to come to his house right now to discuss some complications that had arisen regarding Tuesdays while reading. Said there were irregularities they needed to address as a family before meeting with the attorney to avoid any unnecessary confusion or conflict. I played completely dumb, asking what kind of irregularities could possibly exist with something as straightforward as reading a will. Vincent jumped in, clearly on speaker on their end too, stammering something about paperwork discrepancies, and how it would be in everyone's best interest to present a united front to avoid any family drama that might become public. The entire time they were talking, I could hear this undercurrent of absolute terror in their voices. These men who had been laughing and joking at my father's funeral now sounded like they were about to have simultaneous heart attacks. When I told them I'd prefer to meet at Dad's house in an hour, their reaction was telling. Complete silence for maybe 6 seconds, then Marcus stammering that his place would be more appropriate for a sensitive family discussion. I insisted on Dad's house, and after more uncomfortable silence, they reluctantly agreed. After hanging up, my friend and I did a quick but thorough search of Dad's office, looking for anything that might explain what had my uncles so completely terrified. That's when I found it, tucked inside his copy of The Old Man and the Sea, his favorite novel that he'd made me read probably 4 times growing up, always insisting it contained every life lesson a man needed to know. It was a small black leather journal, Dad's private thoughts from the past 18 months. I only had time to skim through it before my uncles were due to arrive, but what I found made my hands shake with a combination of grief and vindication. The entries from his final months were basically a detailed documentary of Marcus and Vincent's gradual campaign to manipulate and undermine him. Dad had documented everything. Their increasingly frequent visits, their subtle suggestions about updating his will, their carefully worded comments about my supposed inability to handle responsibility, even direct quotes from conversations where they'd questioned his mental competency. The final coherent entry, dated just 2 weeks before he went on the heavy pain medications, mentioned specific instructions about that safety deposit box at Central Trust Bank and explicit directions to make sure Christopher gets the key from Sarah before anyone else could interfere. Before I could fully process the implications of what I was reading, the doorbell rang. Marcus and Vincent stood on the front porch looking like they'd aged 15 years overnight. Marcus had this grotesque fake smile plastered across his face, while Vincent couldn't even make eye contact with me. The contrast between their current panic and their gleeful confidence at the funeral was almost comical. My friend stayed in the kitchen while I led my uncles to the living room. They were clearly unhappy to see Sarah still there, quietly organizing some of Dad's personal papers. Marcus made some pointed comment about unnecessary staff expenses during this transition period, which I completely ignored. Once we were all seated, Marcus launched into this elaborate speech about how they had serious concerns about Tuesdays while reading. He said there might be some surprising developments that could potentially upset the family dynamic and cause unnecessary emotional distress for everyone involved. He mentioned how Dad had made some last-minute changes that might seem out of character to people who didn't understand the full situation. I just sat there letting them dig themselves deeper and deeper into their lies, occasionally nodding as if I was taking their concerns seriously. Finally, Vincent couldn't contain himself and blurted out that they were worried I might have an emotional breakdown when I learned that Dad had changed his will to leave controlling interest in the company to them, with me receiving only what he called a generous monthly allowance. That's when I asked, as innocently as possible, exactly when Dad had made these dramatic changes to his estate planning. Marcus said it had been about 4 weeks ago, when Dad was perfectly lucid and completely aware of what he was signing. He even had the audacity to claim that Dad had expressed disappointment in my life choices and specifically said he didn't trust me with his business legacy. I nodded thoughtfully and asked why they were so concerned about my potential reaction if everything had been handled legally and above board. The look they exchanged was like watching 2 criminals realize they just confessed to their crimes. They started frantically backpedaling, claiming they just wanted to prepare me psychologically and make sure I understood Dad's reasoning for his decisions. I almost lost control right there. Almost showed them the journal, almost told them about Stephanie's witness testimony, almost explained exactly how thoroughly they'd been caught. But my friend's earlier advice echoed in my head, Never show your cards until you've seen theirs and know exactly how you're going to play the hand. So I just nodded again and told them I appreciated their concern but would prefer to hear Dad's final wishes directly from his attorney on Tuesday, as was proper and legal. Then I essentially showed them to the door, ignoring their increasingly desperate attempts to continue the conversation and extract some kind of commitment from me. After they left, my friend emerged from the kitchen with the biggest grin I'd ever seen on his face. He told me he'd recorded the entire conversation on his phone, and we now had them on audio basically admitting they were worried about something that shouldn't concern them if everything was legitimate. I called Sarah in and asked about the safety deposit box key. Her eyes went wide with understanding, and she disappeared upstairs for several minutes before returning with a small manila envelope. Inside was indeed a key and a handwritten note from Dad that simply said, "Christopher, in case of emergency, trust only yourself and the contents of box 847. My friend and I went straight to Central Trust Bank, but it was already closed for the day since it was late afternoon. I'd have to wait until Wednesday morning to discover what Dad had left for me. But I had a feeling that whatever was in that box would be the final piece of the puzzle that would bring my uncle's scheme crashing down around them. That evening, I got a text from my friend saying he'd reached out to Frank Morrison, one of Dad's former business partners who'd retired about 2 years ago. Frank had agreed to meet us for breakfast Wednesday morning before we went to the bank. Apparently, he had some fascinating insights about my uncle's business practices over the years that might be extremely relevant to our situation. I'm sitting here in Dad's kitchen at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep because my mind won't stop racing. The house feels different now, not just empty because Dad's gone, but like it's holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to happen. I don't know exactly what's in that safety deposit box. I don't know what Frank is going to tell us tomorrow, but for the first time since I overheard my uncles laughing at Dad's funeral, I feel like maybe, just maybe, my father was several steps ahead of his scheming brothers all along. Wednesday morning arrived with that crisp clarity that sometimes comes after the worst storms. I met Frank Morrison at Riley's Diner downtown, one of those authentic places with red vinyl booths and waitresses who've been working there since the Carter administration. Frank was already seated when I arrived, a small, balding man in his 70s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan that had definitely seen better decades. Frank didn't waste time with pleasantries. While I was still deciding between coffee and orange juice, he slid a thick manila folder across the table. "Your father asked me to give you this if anything ever happened to him," he said quietly. "Christopher, your dad was one of the smartest men I ever knew, and he saw this coming from miles away." The folder contained photocopies of financial documents, email printouts, and handwritten notes spanning nearly a decade. Frank explained that Dad had been documenting every questionable decision, every attempt at corporate sabotage, every underhanded move Marcus and Vincent had made at the company. Nothing technically illegal, Frank emphasized, but a clear pattern of disloyalty and attempted manipulation. There were records of times they tried to override Dad's executive decisions, clients they'd attempted to poach for their own side ventures, even a failed coup attempt 3 years ago when Dad was first diagnosed. They'd tried to convince the board of directors that his illness made him unfit to continue as CEO. The attempt had backfired spectacularly when Dad proved he was sharper than ever, but it had shown him exactly where his brother's loyalties lay. But the real revelation was that this wasn't just about inheritance or money. This was a 30-year-old grudge that had been festering like an infected wound. According to Frank, Marcus and Vincent had never forgiven Dad for being chosen by their father to run the family business. Back in the early 90s, when Grandpa was considering retirement, they'd pushed hard for him to sell the company and split the proceeds 3 ways. Dad was the only one who'd argued for keeping it in the family, maintaining the legacy their grandfather had built from nothing. Grandpa had sided with Dad, recognizing his vision and leadership abilities, and his brothers had been nursing the resentment ever since. After breakfast, I met my friend at Central Trust Bank. The safety deposit box viewing room was small and private, designed for exactly these kinds of sensitive family situations. Box 847 contained 3 items that would change everything: a USB drive, a sealed envelope addressed to William Chen at Chen and Associates Legal Services, and a letter addressed simply to my son Christopher. I opened my letter right there in that sterile little room, and Dad's words hit me like emotional lightning. The letter was dated 4 months before his death, when he was still lucid, but already knew he was running out of time. Christopher, it began, if you're reading this, then Marcus and Vincent have done exactly what I predicted they would do. I'm sorry you're dealing with this while also trying to grieve my death. That's not fair to you, but life rarely is. I've known for years that my brothers would eventually try to take what isn't theirs. They've been waiting for this opportunity since Dad chose me over them to run the company. The unclosed USB drive contains security footage from our house for the past 8 months. I had a comprehensive surveillance system installed when I first got sick, not because I didn't trust you, but because I knew I couldn't trust them. The envelope for Bill Chen contains my true will, properly executed and witnessed 5 months ago, along with video testimony of my actual wishes and a detailed letter documenting my concerns about potential coercion attempts. There's also a complete medical evaluation proving my mental competency at the time of signing. I wasn't always the father you deserved. I was too demanding sometimes, expected too much, showed my love in ways that probably felt more like criticism than support. But I always believed in you, even when I was too stubborn or proud to say it out loud. The company is yours if you want it. If you don't, that's perfectly fine too. It's your choice to make, not theirs. Trust Bill Chen completely. He's been our family attorney for 28 years and knows exactly what needs to be done. Make them pay for what they tried to do, son. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice. Love, Dad. I didn't realize I was crying until my friend handed me a tissue. We took everything back to his apartment to examine the USB drive, and what we found was even more damning than I dared to hope. Dad's security system was remarkably sophisticated, with tiny cameras hidden throughout the house that captured everything in crystal clear high definition. The footage showed Marcus and Vincent visiting repeatedly during Dad's final weeks, always when I wasn't there, always carrying legal documents. But the smoking gun was the recording from their final visit, the day they'd coerced him into signing their fraudulent will. Dad was barely conscious, propped up in bed and clearly heavily medicated, when Marcus literally guided his hand to sign papers, while Vincent kept watch at the bedroom door. The witness they brought never actually interacted with Dad or confirmed his awareness of what he was signing. It was all there in perfect 4K resolution with timestamps and metadata that would hold up in any court. Dad had essentially created the perfect trap, and my uncles had walked into it with their eyes wide open. Tuesday morning came, and I felt this strange sense of calm that I hadn't experienced since before Dad got sick. I'd spent Monday night back in my childhood bedroom for the first time in probably 15 years, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. The old ceiling fan still made that rhythmic clicking noise every third rotation that used to drive me crazy, but now felt almost comforting. I arrived at Bill Chen's office 20 minutes early, bringing my friend Sarah and my girlfriend Rebecca, who had flown in Monday night after I finally explained everything that was happening. Rebecca comes from one of those impossibly functional families where everyone actually likes each other and has weekly game nights, so all this family drama was completely foreign to her. But she held my hand during the entire drive over and promised to be my anchor no matter what happened. Bill Chen was an elegant man in his 60s with perfectly pressed suits and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of handling family crises. He greeted me with a knowing look that immediately made me understand why Dad had trusted him so completely. I handed him the envelope from the safety deposit box, and he nodded without surprise, asking me to wait in the conference room while he reviewed the contents. Marcus and Vincent arrived exactly on time with their wives and adult children in tow, clearly attempting to present this united front of family solidarity. They faltered visibly when they saw me sitting there with my own support system, especially Sarah, whose presence they obviously hadn't expected. Marcus tried to make some condescending comment about non-family members attending a private legal proceeding, but Bill Chen shut that down immediately with a kind of quiet authority that made it clear he was completely in control of the situation. Once everyone was seated around the polished conference table, Bill began by explaining that there appeared to be some confusion regarding my father's final wishes, as 2 different wills had been presented to his office. One dated 5 months before Dad's death, and another supposedly executed just 4 weeks before he passed away. Marcus couldn't hide his triumphant smirk. Vincent studied his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. The tension in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. Then Bill dropped a nuclear bomb that obliterated their entire scheme. Before proceeding with either document, he said calmly, "I'd like everyone to watch a video that George recorded 5 months ago when he executed his official will and testament." The color didn't just drain from my uncle's faces. It evacuated so fast I thought they might actually faint right there in their leather chairs. Bill set up his laptop and played the video that would destroy them completely. There was Dad, looking thin and tired but absolutely alert and coherent, sitting in this very office on a bright spring morning. He stated the date clearly, confirmed he was of sound mind and not under any medication that would impair his judgment, and then spoke directly to the camera with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "I, George Peterson, being of sound mind and body, declare this to be my last will and testament. All previous wills are hereby revoked. I'm recording this video to confirm that this document reflects my true wishes and to address a serious concern I have about my brothers Marcus and Vincent Peterson." Dad went on to explain that his brothers had been pressuring him to change his will in their favor, making subtle threats about my supposed incompetence and inability to handle responsibility. He stated clearly that if any document appeared after this date claiming to supersede this will, especially if it surfaced during his final days when he might be under heavy medication, it should be investigated thoroughly for coercion or fraud. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of Dad's voice outlining his actual wishes. The house and 70% of the company shares would go to me. Sarah would receive a substantial retirement package and could live in the guest house for as long as she wanted. Stephanie would receive a scholarship fund Dad had established to help her complete her nursing degree. Marcus and Vincent would each receive 15% of the company shares and a monetary inheritance, but then came the devastating final clause. Any attempt to contest this will would result in that person's entire inheritance being donated to the American Cancer Society instead. Dad had anticipated their greed and used it against them like a perfectly designed trap. When the video ended, you could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Bill calmly stated that given the video testimony plus the security footage I'd provided showing the circumstances under which the later will had been signed, he would be proceeding only with the original will as Dad's true final wishes. That's when Marcus completely lost control. He exploded out of his chair, screaming about how this was all an elaborate setup, how Dad hadn't been mentally competent 5 months ago, how I'd somehow manipulated everything from behind the scenes. His face turned this alarming shade of purple as he ranted about family loyalty and respect for the dead, seemingly oblivious to the irony of his words. Vincent, always the more calculating of the two, just sat there with his head in his hands. He knew they were completely destroyed, caught red-handed in an attempted fraud that could have landed them in prison if Dad had chosen to pursue criminal charges instead of simply outsmarting them. Bill let Marcus rant himself into exhaustion, then simply stated that he'd be happy to present all the evidence to a court if Marcus wanted to contest the will. But he reminded him, in that quietly devastating way that lawyers perfect over decades, of the consequences outlined in the video for anyone who chose that path. In the end, they accepted their 15% shares and left with whatever dignity they could salvage. But not before Marcus hissed at me that this wasn't over and that I destroyed our family forever. The irony was so thick it was almost funny. The man who had been laughing at my father's funeral about stealing my inheritance was now accusing me of destroying family unity. It's been 2 weeks since that confrontation, and I'm slowly settling into this new reality. Living in Dad's house, my house now, is still surreal. I had to call a plumber yesterday because the upstairs bathroom sink keeps dripping, and I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to decipher Dad's Byzantine filing system for household maintenance records. The company transition is more complex and will take months to fully navigate. I've been meeting individually with board members, getting a sense of the corporate culture and understanding where various loyalties lie. Some were clearly in my uncle's camp and aren't thrilled about my sudden promotion to leadership, but most seem genuinely willing to give me a chance to prove myself, which is all I can ask for. Sarah is staying on permanently, of course. We spent last weekend cleaning out the guest house together, and she's slowly moving her personal belongings in. I found her crying in Dad's closet yesterday while sorting through his clothes for donation. We ended up sitting on the floor looking through old photographs she'd kept of company picnics and holiday parties, seeing sides of Dad I'd rarely witnessed during my childhood. The man who could be so stern and demanding at home was apparently known for his terrible dad jokes and his annual tradition of dressing up as Santa for the office Christmas party. As for Marcus and Vincent, they've maintained complete radio silence since that devastating day in Bill Chen's office. Their wives have called Rebecca a few times, ostensibly to smooth things over, but really just fishing for information about what I might be planning next. The answer is simple. I'm planning to run the company with